on this. John, you can share the screen and begin.
All right, well, good evening. And again, I'm going to share a tremendous amount of information in a very short period of time. And I look forward to any questions afterwards, but just think of this as a chance to see a lot of pictures and hear a lot of information. So this is really about birds, forest management, and a changing climate. And I'm going to start right in here. Let's see here. So most of you care about forests. You love wildlife, whether it's porcupines or mountain lions or acorn woodpeckers or golden crowned kinglets or osprey or stellar jays or ouzels. All of these are the kinds of species that make us care not just about them or a particular place, but about the overall ecosystem and how it provides for the diversity of species. So golden mantled ground squirrel or the American marten, one of the species that our staff studies in particular, are just some of the wildlife that are out in the Stanislaus National Forest in Yosemite Park. Our center deals with roughly about 3 million acres that we attempt to be the lead advocate for wildlife, water, forest, wildland protection, stopping pollution, and trying to be especially preventive of the most dire threats from wildfire and drought disease. So as was mentioned, I spent 13 years as a firefighter with the Forest Service, traveled all over the United States fighting wildfires. I just put in 3 shots here just to point out that I trained firefighters in fire behavior, even hotshot crews. And so I have a very high degree of experience and expertise related to fire and forests. So I left the Forest Service in high frustration because when I was working for the Forest Service was clear cutting up to 40-acre blocks of forest, targeting in many cases the best old growth trees. And where they weren't clear cutting, they were cutting areas where they took out the biggest and nicest trees and just left the thickets of smaller and younger trees just to grow into dense stands that are highly flammable. The key information I'm providing in this slideshow program is that by going back and looking at museum pictures and looking at UC Bancroft Library and all these other places, you can see that the forest that John Muir talked about, of the forest of the Sierra Nevada in the late 1800s and the very early 1900s, were forests that were open and park-like, that you could ride, in many cases, a horse through at a trot or a gallop. And then when the loggers cut, again, the biggest and best trees over and over as they moved across the forest, it changed the forest. And instead of it being this open park-like forest, it became a forest that had lost the most resistant trees, the trees most resistant to fire and in many cases insects and disease, but also it became less of a fire-resistant forest. So in the early days, and not just the 1800s, but into the early 1900s, the fires that burned in areas around Twainhart and Pinecrest and Yosemite area and other places, when there was a fire, people got their rakes, they went out, they scraped the fuels back. And you can see here, shirt off, we're fighting the fire, and it was an open park-like forest. Then in many cases, the fires crept around. And this was the concentrated firefighting crews in the early 1910s, 1915, 1920 era that were basically raking pine needles and leaves back so there'd be bare soil for the fire to burn the edge to and go out. The Civilian Conservation Corps in the end of the 1920s took 2 million young men and placed them on federal public lands out across America, mostly in the West. Families who had their sons out in those places doing various projects like building lookout towers or doing campgrounds or ranger stations or whatever, began to care more about the forest. People began to visit the forest more and more and more, especially as people had automobiles. And the Forest Service began a policy of trying to put out fires. It's called the 10 a.m. rule. And they went out of their way all the way through into the 1980s and 1990s, trying to put out every fire by 10 the next morning, which meant fires couldn't burn up the pine needles, the branches, the fallen logs, the brush that accumulated, thickets of trees. And so we had fire suppression, fire exclusion for all those years. All of that was exacerbated by the technology that became available after the Vietnam War, where there was a tremendous amount of equipment available to try and drop retardant on fires, use helicopters to slow fires, hotshot crews like the one I served on, just like this, going out there and cutting fire lines, burning fires, putting backfires out that would burn toward the fires, and doing everything possible to stop fires from burning. But the natural, open, park-like forests that were there for thousands and thousands of years were dominated by large, individual, scattered, big old trees, scattered, medium, and some small trees, and a more open and park-like condition. So these trees were resistant until they were targeted by clear cutting. And the Forest Service, really starting in the 1950s, but ramping it up in the 60s, began clear cutting 40-acre blocks all across the West, especially in Washington, Oregon, and California. And here in the Sierra Nevada, cutting area after area. There's a picture I took 1970 something, way back, of a fresh clear cut that the Forest Service doing. This was the habitat after Forest Service was managing the land. And they were doing it to maximize the amount of wood production that could come off by taking all the trees that could be made into wood and then converting them into tree plantations, almost all ponderosa pine, in some cases some sugar pine and Douglas fir, to try and grow a crop of trees in the most dense and most intensely productive fashion. But it also made them incredibly vulnerable to a wildfire, because fire just moves from stem to stem. And where they were not doing clear cutting and just had done selection thinning of the biggest and best trees, the understory trees grew into thickets. Dead trees that were in the midst of them all created high fire risk. So in the early 1990s, conservation groups, the Sierra Club, Audubon, I actually was partnering with Sierra Club and Audubon, the Sacramento representatives for each of those groups, Barb Boyle, Dan Taylor, and others, to try and stop the clear cuts that were affecting spotted owls and their young, and to also protect other species like the Pacific fisher. So we worked, we threatened lawsuits, we did everything possible to try and convince the Forest Service it was not a good strategy to keep cutting old growth trees that were important to pileated woodpecker and other species. Forest Service continued to cut clear cuts until lawsuits in the Pacific Northwest ground down the logging there to almost nothing. It brought it to a halt. The timber industry collapsed in many areas. Local economies were put out of work. There was so much of a fallout because of environmentalist lawsuits that blocked clear cuts that were harming spotted owls in particular and other species. And so this is a Forest Service clear cut. I took this picture many, many years ago, but these clear cuts all of a sudden were halted in the mid-1990s, in 1993 and 1994. And the Forest Service and the Sierra Nevada in particular agreed to shift to what they called the Cal-Al EIS, or the CASPO guidelines, which were to reduce clear cuts to almost nothing, to leave 30% to 40% of the largest trees in any area, and to have a well-stocked stand after logging was finished, and to retain all trees 30 inches and larger in diameter. This has been applied now for about 25 years in the Sierra Nevada, and the trees that were 30 inches then, many are 38, 40, 42 inches, and have gotten bigger and are doing better. The timber industry had to shift, because where before there were clear cuts and a faller with a chainsaw could come in and cut one tree, fall into an opening, cut the next tree, fall into the opening, next tree into an opening. Now, when you had to thin the trees fell into other trees. And so they used heavy equipment called cut the length systems, feller bunchers, and others. In this case, a shear cuts the tree. It grabs on, the equipment has these grapples that hold onto the side of the tree, lifts it up into the air, turns it sideways and piles it, moves on to the next tree, shears it, lifts it up, puts it in a pile, and moves across. Very effective and productive, far more productive than when they had lots of loggers working for them. On SPI lands, Sierra Pacific Industries, which is 1.5 million acres in Northern California, they continue to do what is fully legally allowed by the Forest Practice Act on private lands in California. which is the clear cut. So they clear cut or do modified clear cuts, visual retention, where they leave a few scattered little trees to say, see, we're not really totally taking everything. We're leaving a few scattered little trees. But this is what it looks like when you fly overhead. These are clear cut units where they cut 20-acre blocks, and 10 years later come in and cut a block in between those two clear cuts, and 10 years later cut another block on the other side, and basically every 50 years will come through and cut trees in 10 year increments. So trees are cut at 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, and 50 years, and starting all over again. And this is what is happening on private timberlands in the Sierra Nevada all over. It's not good for wildlife, especially not good for birds. And it's monoculture in many cases of ponderosa pines or ponderosa pines and Douglas firs that are planted in crops. So this is on private lands. And this is a picture I took last year out on the SBI clear cut on Duckwall Mountain out in the within the boundaries of the Stanislaus Forest, but on private lands. It's not good for nuthatches. It's not good for red-breasted sapsuckers or other species. On Forest Service land, something I mentioned before some of you was this, we were waiting for the program to start. The Forest Service has had a tremendous lack of capacity, doesn't have enough employees. It's 30% in the region and 30% in the Stanislaus Forest of unfilled positions. They have less fire engines they're supposed to have. They have less crews to go out there and do recreation, for forest management, for all these different management things. And when there are thickets of small trees, they have no economic incentive to get in there, do something to keep it from all burning up. Forest Service scientists and university scientists say you need to have open park-like stands. Forest Service has a goal to use thinning logging like this to go in and open up stands. This is an area near Pinecrest. It's an area our center thinks is an excellent Forest Service logging project that at the end of logging looks like this. By the time the ground covers back and the ferns and others, looks like hardly anything has even been done, but they produced a tremendous amount of wood, but they left it less likely to burn up. But literally hundreds of thousands of acres in each national forest are thickets highly prone to high severity wildfires and megafires. This is the Stanislaus Forest in many areas, which are examples of how much the fuels are adjacent, connected to each other, and ready to burn. So when we have major fires, the fires burn with high severity. This is the rim fire that burned in 2013. Just in 3 days, there was so much heat created. The fuels were so dry, the fire created its own pyrocumulus cloud like this that sucked in the winds at such high intensity. It fed the fire, and it literally nuked areas all across the forest. This is in Yosemite Park. This is across in the Stanislaus Forest area. This is the area again right at Yosemite Park. So many areas burned at high severity. If you see the blue line, it's going down kind of to the right middle of the picture. That's the Yosemite Park boundary. All the red areas in Yosemite Park were high severity, almost every tree killed. The red areas to the left of the blue line, Stanislaus Forest, almost every tree killed. This is high severity wildfire. It's not good for birds, for people, for watershed values, for recreation, for anything. This is the forest after high severity wildfire. Looks like hell. I hate it. Many of these places our center fought for 20 to 25 years to protect from overly aggressive Forest Service logging. We managed to do a lot of efforts, and then they were roasted by the fire at high severity. To compound things, in 2014 through 2017, there was drought, intense drought, bark beetles that were, managed to increase because of the wildfire, bored through the cambium or through the bark into the cambium layer of the tree. This is Western pine beetle, top right, and there's another one off on the left on the bottom. I peeled back the bark, and you can see the trees, the beetles under the bark. And this is the sap that's the tree has tried to produce to push the beetles out, but it was overwhelmed. Hundreds and hundreds of beetles on some trees, thousands, and the trees succumbed. So all across the forest for many years, trees were dying. They're also dying this year in many places, although not to this extent. So for a number of years, 150 million trees were counted by the Forest Service with aerial surveys of being 1 foot or larger across the Sierra Nevada that were dying from bark beetles. So on top of the threat of wildfires, and again, you can just see all the dead fuel that this area would burn so severely if a fire came through, but there was the drought, bark beetles, in some cases, even diseases that all are creating this tremendous stress on forests. So Forest Service came out with a number of scientific proposals to do better management, fewer trees on the upper slopes and south-facing slopes, more trees in the bottom areas, but not trying to maximize the growth of trees, but instead looking at forests that are naturally resilient, that have not been managed, that have lightning fires, and have constantly just had natural conditions. They call it ICO conditions, scattered individual trees for the I, clumps for the C, and openings for the O, ICO. And this is what they say the Sierra Nevada forest should look like. Because this is a picture of a clump in a historic photo where it's open and park-like and a forest that's resilient. And while many of us who've come to see forests that are thick, dense, lush, and just so full of trees as what is natural, this is what Forest Service and research scientists are saying is a natural forest. Comparing inventories done in 1911 with inventories of the same exact national forest areas in 2011, the average number of trees in 1911 was 20 to 23 trees per acre. In 2011, it was 6 to 7 times that much, over 140 trees per acre, which creates so much fire risk. So the goal is to get more open park-like stands. This is just a quick example of, there's a bunch of timberinish people in here. There are deer hunters. There are good old redneck boys. There are people who can't agree with environmentalists on anything, except as part of this forest stakeholder group, they agreed to put aside all of their positions, and environmentalists and businesses and others agreed to put aside our interests and to agree to a middle ground compromise that is best for the forest to get the forest back in a historic condition. So even though our center fought logging of big old trees for 20 some years and everything, we began actively supporting the Forest Service cutting small and medium-sized trees as the scientists recommend to get a more open park-like condition, to have a forest that has space between the trees, that has a forest that can get the ground covers and wildflowers growing again because they're not shaded out by the overstory canopy. And we've also pushed for keeping the areas of spotted owl packs having some higher canopy, while spotted owl territories being more open and the general forest being more open like this. In addition, timber industry folks who before fought against it have strongly endorsed broadcast prescribed burning in our area, in our region, with the Forest Service carefully at the end of the season doing understory burning to get fire to burn up 70, 90 years of pine needles, branches, pine cones, fallen trees, and other fuels, and to get the forest back into a more balanced condition. And that is very difficult when so many trees die from bark beetles and drought that now, either fall over or have to be cut and to put on the forest floor so that they can at least be burned to some degree, so that you don't have just massive amounts of tons of fuel per acre that can fuel the next major wildfire, like the mosquito fire that's burning right now in our Forest Hill. So this is an open park-like forest condition that Forest Service scientists and research scientists from universities, UC Davis, UC Berkeley, other places throughout the West are telling us this is a resilient and resistant forest. It's resistant to fire, and it's resilient to bark beetles and drought and disease because the trees are so vigorous by having spacing that they are able to have enough water, have enough nutrients that they can make it in many cases through drought condition. And as was mentioned at the very beginning, climate change is just off the scale in terms of anything we thought was going to happen. I've been on top of the issue for somewhere around 40 years. We thought it was going to take 50 to 100 years for it to really kick in. Again, 7 of the largest fires that ever burned in California have burned in the last 3 years. 10 of the largest that ever burned in California have burned in the last 20 years. And over, we're seeing that fires are causing so much more damage, and the climate change is affecting the pika and many other species who only have so much habitat at high elevations to adjust to before they run out of habitat. So I was out in the forest today in both Yosemite and Stanislaus Forest. There are places, I did not take this picture today, but this is a typical picture of many of the places you can see out there where bark beetles again are starting to kill many of the trees. And there are fires that are burning out of control. The McKinney fire up on the north end of the state that burned right at the Oregon border. Fires, there's a complex of fires over in 6 Rivers, I think it is, near Mendocino and other places where there's a lot of, I think 30 to 50,000 acres that have been burning. Mosquito fire, I was on a call with the forest supervisor for the Tahoe Forest yesterday, and he said it was somewhere around 15,000 acres then and was threatening Forest Hill. This is not good for people, but I'm talking to you guys about birds and wildlife. This is not good for birds and wildlife. And even if you're thinking blackback woodpeckers, there are so many dead trees out there. I won't say 100 times more than can be used, but many, many, many times more than all the black-headed woodpeckers that are out there can possibly utilize just from the rim fire that burned 400 square miles. And this is an example. This is up at 8,000 feet. It's called the Donnell Fire. It's a fire that a friend of mine on the Forest Service took a picture when it was a fairly small fire, but you can just see the intensity of it burning. It burned 30,000 acres at 8 to 10,000 feet in elevation. We used to believe that those were far too high to ever burn, but they dry out so much during these long, dry summers now that they do burn with intensity, and they do not provide habitat, resilient habitat, even for blackback woodpeckers or other cavity-dwelling species, or those that favor the beetles and worms that are in the trees. There's just so much that has now been changed because of the changing climate. So back to what can we do to best help birds and recreation, scenic value, watershed, and all our values. We can carefully remove the trees in a mosaic pattern that Forest Service scientists can identify as a prescription that provides for that middle ground, not for timber industry production, but leaves all the medium, large, and large trees, all of them, not some, all of them, and takes many of the trees smaller in diameter. We can get broadcast burning into as much as possible of the forest where there's no road access. You can't get into to do thinning logging. The slopes are too steep or whatever, but you can do backing fires down in the canyons that back down and protect many of the trees. And we can create forests that don't look the same as what we've always thought of. What a beautiful forest, but you can see the values that are there. There's still lots of trees for wildlife. There's more opportunity for the oaks, the alders, the aspens, and others to come into these forest stands because they're getting sun again. And over a few years after the ground covers come back after burning, we have forests that truly provide the benefits that most of us will look at and say, yeah, it's a lot more open than we're used to, but we can see that forest could survive a high intensity fire. So for the evening grosbeak, the mountain bluebird, for all the species that you guys care about and that I care about, and for the diversity of habitat that's out there, the need to protect the meadows from overgrazing by livestock, or that may also affect how much forage is available for deer, for trying to provide the diversity of habitat at the highest elevations for Sierra Nevada red fox, for all the different species that we're trying to protect, and especially for the birds that we care about, Clark nutcrackers, western tanager, and others. The goal is for environmentalists to move past our long-held positions of don't cut trees, to cut the right trees only in the places that are appropriate, not on steep slopes, not in sensitive wildlife habitat, but across vast areas of the forest where we can protect those other very sensitive habitats in a fashion that we are making the forest more resistant. So thank you, a lot of information. I'm going to stop now and I'll be glad to answer questions, or if you guys feel like that was enough, I'm good with that. And let's see, I think I've stopped sharing, so it's back to you, Sal.